The soft glow of countless candelabras shimmered against the gilded walls of Almack's assembly rooms, casting a radiance that made the chandeliers seem like suspended constellations above the assembled crowd. The opening ball of the London season had commenced, and the air was thick with anticipation, laughter, and the clinking of delicate glasses. Among the polished throng, the soft rustle of silk gowns and the patter of polished boots upon the parquet floor formed a familiar symphony, yet that evening held a different kind of electricity, one not easily subdued by mere decorum. Clara stood near the grand staircase, framed in powder blue velvet that accentuated the chestnut hues of her elegantly pinned hair. A single delicate curl had escaped the resilient coil above her temple, lying in the shadow of a small birthmark she had long thought her secret signature. The pale fabric of her dress hugged her slender figure without artifice, designed with the subtlety of restraint and the sophistication only a widow who had navigated these rooms before could summon. She was 28, and bore with quiet confidence the kind of poise cultivated through endurance to London's ton. She was the widow who had steadfastly refused to entertain the endless parade of suitors. No dazzling smiles of reconciliation, no whispered hints of second weddings. Her resolution was as much armor as the lace and brocade she adorned. Her deep hazel eyes roamed the room with deliberate casualness, observing as society's gilded youth paraded beneath the glittering ceiling. Her gaze paused on familiar faces, the smiles, the glances, the endless conversations about alliances and fortunes. Yet, beneath the surface, Clara sensed the collective quiet evaluation, the undercurrent of curiosity and quiet judgment, reserved for a widow who had, so far, denied society's expectations. Across the room, near a cluster of the ton's most talked-about scions, stood Lord Holbrook, newly titled Duke, by the death of his father just weeks prior. He was a figure both magnetic and vexing. At 34, he bore the casual wildness of a man who had once revelled recklessly in youth's excess, now restrained beneath the weight of inherited responsibility. His dark brown hair, still long and slightly wavy, was carefully tied back, perhaps an effort to order the unruly part of himself that past mistakes had made visible. Storm-grey eyes, deep and intense, scanned the room with a measured scrutiny, a thoughtful frown knitting his brow. The faint scar along his right cheekbone, a souvenir of some youthful indiscretion, added to the air of dangerous charm that set tongues wagging whenever he entered a room. Their worlds collided as Clara gracefully accepted an invitation to dance from a polite but clearly hopeless suitor. Her steps steady and unyielding, despite the heat of whispered gossip she could feel like a gaze upon her back. And then, as if pulled by some invisible thread, her eyes met his somewhere near, the orchestra's delicate strains. Time seemed to narrow. The noise of the ball warped into indistinct colours around her. His stormy grey gaze locked with her deep hazel, somewhere between challenge and unspoken understanding, the quiet recognition of two flawed souls who had each borne their own reckoning. For the briefest moment, it was as if the world held its breath, two sets of eyes tracing the silence between them, weighed down by secrets neither dared to voice. There was no smile, no overt invitation, only a spark, muted and wary, carried in the measured restraint of their glances. Clara's heart betrayed her for a scant heartbeat before she dipped her chin and turned away with the practiced grace of a woman who had mastered the art of hiding emotion beneath a veneer of composure. Around them, conversation faltered and flourished. The whispering began anew, rippling through the crowd. "Did you see? Lord Holbrook met Widow Clara," and yet no one overheard a word. Such restraint, Or perhaps a game unseen. A lady in a rose-pink gown murmured to her companion over the faint clinking of champagne flutes. The murmur spread, like wildfire licking the edges of hushed speculation. Society had taken note. The widow, steadfast against the idea of second marriage, and the duke, burdened by the shadow of his past, now thrown into the same tangled dance. Clara's thoughts, however, were less concerned with idle gossip and more with the walls she had built carefully around herself. Widowhood had been her armor. For 3 years she had worn it like a shield against intrusion, the grief wrought in quiet solitude, binding her in silent vows. She was determined never to fall again into what seemed a web of society's contrivances, where marriages could be as cold as crystal chandeliers, dazzling in appearance, but brittle and hollow beneath. And yet, Lord Holbrook's eyes had unsettled something deep within her, a flicker of doubt carefully tucked away beneath her measured breath. The music swelled, a stately waltz commencing, and hands were taken, promises danced, and whispered scandal crept unseen along the walls. The season had begun. Asterisk. Later, the morning sun filtered through the tall sash windows of Clara's townhouse on Grosvenor Street, casting soft golden pools upon the polished mahogany floor and cream-painted walls. The room smelled faintly of lavender and beeswax, an attempt at calm and order amid the turbulence of society's demands. Clara sat poised, the quiet confidence from the previous night's ball, still shimmering beneath the surface, but the weight of expectation pressing on her with renewed force. Her chaperone, Mrs. Pembroke, a woman whose hawkish eyes had long been the measure of propriety in London's finest drawing-rooms, perched like a sparrow on the edge of a cushioned chair opposite her. Her lips pursed tightly, her countenance grim with thinly veiled concern. "Miss Clara, Mrs. Pembroke began, her voice brittle. "I must say, your recent reticence regarding suitors is beginning to stir quiet disappointment, or worse, dismay in some quarters." Clara's delicate fingers tightened around her teacup, the warmth of faint comfort against the sharpness of the words. "Pembroke," she echoed coolly, eyes steady yet guarded. "I fail to see how upholding my vow to remain a widow disappoints anyone beyond society's unyielding appetite for gossip." Mrs. Pembroke sighed, leaning in with the weight of authority. Mrs. Pembroke believed the season demanded. "It is not merely gossip. You would do well to remember that your reputation is a fragile thing, Miss Clara. And the men you scorn now may well be those drawn to your side once the season is in full swing. I have received several suggestions that continued refusal might place you in less esteemed company." Clara arched an eyebrow, a flicker of impatience crossing her face. "Less esteemed? Pray, do enlighten me what company you suggest is preferable when the most notable gentlemen see fit to avoid my presence due to my coldness of heart." Mrs. Pembroke's lips thinned further, but she persisted. "Some of these gentlemen, yes, may bear caution upon your name foolish gossip about past grief-made armor, but they are sincere men. And propriety, as you doubtless know, is the currency of this season. Your reserves betray you." Clara's gaze dropped for a moment to the polished floorboards, her thoughts drifting. The last 3 years, every rejection had been a quiet act of resistance, not merely to suitors, but to a future she believed had been shattered. She was a fortress built on loss, her armor forged from silence and resolve. Yet, even now, beneath the weight of society's unspoken eyes, there stirred a tremor. She dared not speak aloud. A flicker of yearning, perhaps, or something more dangerous, hope. Before she could formulate a response, a servant quietly entered, delivering an envelope sealed with a wax crest, familiar enough to halt even Mrs. Pembroke's pointed gaze. Clara's eyes widened slightly as she recognized the seal, the Marquis's coronet, now Duke Holbrook's. She broke the wax with trembling fingers, pulling free a folded slip of heavy paper, the Duke's immaculate handwriting looping elegantly across the page. Miss Clara, a private audience at your earliest convenience would honour me. I wish to speak not as a man merely burdened by title, but as one seeking understanding beyond whispered scandal. Clara's breath caught. The room seemed impossibly still, the morning light sharpening around her as the letter fell to her lap. Mrs. Pembroke's eyes narrowed with suspicion, while Clara's heart hammered beneath the layers of guarded composure. I see, Mrs. Pembroke said dryly. Lord Holbrook wishes to involve himself in your affairs. Now. Clara folded the note with calm precision, sensing the stirrings of conflict within herself, a silent battle between the safety of solitude and the daunting call of uncertain possibility. Widowhood had been her armour, sure. Yet for the first time in many moons, that armour felt oddly heavy, as if the weapons she wielded might no longer suffice against the tides gathering beyond her threshold. Perhaps, Clara said softly, meeting Mrs. Prah. Perhaps. Pembroke's sharp gaze with something harder than defiance. It is time I listen. Outside, the city of London bustled as usual, oblivious to the quiet turning of a page within one woman's life. The season was well underway, and so too, perhaps, was the beginning of a second, more dangerous dance. The estate lay spread before Clara like a waking memory, the gentle sway of the ancient oaks casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. The afternoon sun filtered through their branches, dappling the gravel paths that her footsteps now traced with a quiet reverence. Her hands, still cool beneath the fine lace gloves, rested lightly on the wrought iron fence that bordered the rose garden, her late husband's favourite sanctuary. Each thorn stem and unfolding petal stirred the ghosts of days when laughter still found its easy place here, before grief wrapped itself so tightly around her heart. She inhaled deeply, the scent of damp earth and blooming honeysuckle flooding her senses. The scent pulled at the corners of her memory, unrelenting and bittersweet. It was as if the very air of the estate whispered of all that was lost, and all that might still linger in the spaces between. The trustees had tended well, or at least adequately, but no one could care for the house as she had, for this was her tether to a life irrevocably changed. Yet now, despite the heaviness that clung to her bones like winter's chill, there was an unfamiliar note underneath, the quiet insistence of possibility, as if this place held a secret door that might open yet again. Clara's gaze swept the horizon, where the slate roof of the manor caught the delicate light, its windows glinting like polished eyes. A figure approached down the pathway, tall, deliberate, presence unmistakable even at this distance. Lord Holbrook. He came to the edge of the garden, pausing as if unsure whether to step into this world that belonged so intrinsically to her. His dark hair caught the sunlight in stray waves, a careless contrast to the sharp tailoring of his coat. There was a weariness etched into the lines around his stormy grey eyes, a burden she recognized in herself, though expressed so differently. He raised a polite nod, his scar catching the soft late afternoon light for a fleeting moment, before he settled his gaze on the roses at her side. "Clara," he said quietly, voice threading through the stillness like a tentative offering. "I thought it fitting to come here to see for myself the place your late husband held dear." She turned fully to face him. A wry smile touching the curve of her lips, brittle as the petals beneath her fingertips. "It is, and yet it never was mine to claim. The trustees guard it like sentinels, and I am merely their silent guest." His eyes donned a shadowed expression, a mixture of respect and something more tangled. "It is not your silence I wish to challenge, but the solitude you have sworn upon yourself, Clara. Widowhood can be a refuge, but also a prison." Her breath stuttered, caught at the truth of his words. "You speak as if you've read my innermost thoughts. A man who has lived too long beneath the weight of expectations often finds little need to guess." He stepped closer, the gravel crunching faintly beneath his boots. "I have spent years trapped by the demands of a title no man desires, the Duke of Holbrook, weary with his own imperfections." She searched his face and found there the kind of honesty that unsettled. A vulnerability swathed, not in softness, but in a hard-earned dignity. "And yet you come here," she said slowly, "to this house, this season of my life, with all its quiet mourning, as a guest. I wonder, what do you hope to find?" His gaze dropped briefly, then rose again, unwavering. "Perhaps the same as you, a chance to carve a new path from the remnants of the old, to defy the whispered stories that shape us." Clara's fingers traced a jagged line along the ironwork, steadying herself against the surge of unexpected hope. "Do you believe a woman's future can be rewritten after her husband's death, or is it merely the folly of a lonely season?" "Not folly," he said firmly. "Courage." The weight between them grew heavier in the shrinking light. Words laced with more than either dared name aloud. A shared understanding, delicate and potent, settled quietly as the first stars began to prick the early evening sky. In Tfutos, the great hall bloomed with candlelight, its crystal chandeliers shimmering like constellations above the long polished tables. The gathered company murmured polite exchanges beneath the vaulted ceilings, the soft clinking of silverware punctuating the hum. Clara sat poised between the carefully carved oak pilasters, her posture rigid, yet within, the pulse of anxious expectation beat firm. Dinner at the estate had become a crucible, an event where whispered intrigues danced like shadows behind lace fans and the glinting eyes of envious noblewomen. Tonight, those shadows threatened to coalesce into something sharper. Lady Veronica, the stepmother, whose relentless ambitions preluded her every smile, had taken her place at the far end of the dais, the gleam of long gloves brushing against the edges of her wineglass like a delicate threat. The whispers about late Lord Winter's will had begun weeks ago, but tonight, emboldened by guests and the sinuous curves of gossip, the poison seeped deeper. "My dear Clara," Lady Veronica's voice was honeyed venom as she raised it just enough to catch several ears. "One does wonder if the late Earl truly intended for his entire estate to rest so entirely upon the shoulders of a young widow. Such a responsibility might indeed require reconsideration." A ripple of polite murmurs didn't need encouragement. Embers of speculation sparked instantly among the guests. Clara felt the prickling sting of every gaze turned her way, measuring, judging, stripping away the veneer of respectability she had so carefully cultivated. Her fingers clenched beneath the table, palms slick with cool sweat. The room had fallen into a breathless silence, ripe for the next move. Before she could shape an answer, Lord Holbrook's voice cut through the tension like a sharpened blade, low and deadly. "Lady Veronica," he said, his tone unyielding and dark with barely restrained fury, "your insinuations are not only baseless, but slanderous. To question the Earl's testament is to dishonor his memory and jeopardize the peace we owe his widow." Heads turned fully now, some to gape, others to whisper more urgently. The sharp flicker of surprise in Lady Veronica's eyes was quickly masked by a frosty smile. "Lord Holbrook," she replied smoothly, "I merely echo concerns that have been voiced by parties whose stakes are perhaps less sentimental and more practical." The Duke's jaw tightened. A visible tremor betraying the storm raging beneath his composed exterior. "There is no room for discontent, bred of greed or jealousy within these walls." I trust Miss Clara to steward this estate with the dignity its history demands, and so shall it remain." The room seemed to hold its breath as the tempest within Lord Holbrook threatened to shatter the fragile calm. Clara watched with a mix of gratitude and trepidation, the side of him so rarely shown, raw and fiercely protective. It unsettled the careful balance she had maintained, yet reminded her that he was not the polished, distant nobleman the tongue often whispered about. There was a man beneath the facade, flawed in fire and iron. A delicate murmur returned, though the angles of suspicion had sharpened beneath the surface. Clara's lips pressed into a firm, unreadable line. She met Lady Veronica's gaze with the cool steadiness of a fortress wall, her silence a blade of resistance more formidable than any spoken word. Within the silence, Clara's mind raced. What more could she do? To answer directly would invite more questions, more needless conflict. Instead, her quiet resolve became her shield, a steadfast promise that she would not yield her place nor her honour to the idle whims of society's gossip. Across the table, Lord Holbrook's glance flickered to hers, steady, unwavering, an unspoken alliance forged in the crucible of the night's assault. They were for now bound together by a common defence, against slander, against isolation, and perhaps against the parts of themselves they feared might yet be revealed. Beneath the crystal chandeliers and swirling gowns, the whispered scandal might have gained momentum, but Clara's armoured widowhood, once her solitude, now her sanctuary, stood unbroken, even as the storm darkened on the horizon. The heavy oaken door clicked softly shut behind Clara, the faintest echo of its closing swallowed by the deep hush of the Duke's private study. Inside, the glow of wrought-iron sconces flickered over shelves, lined with leather-bound tomes, and the muted gleam of polished mahogany. The familiar scent of old parchment mixed with cedar filled the air, a quiet sanctuary of thought and shadows. Lord Holbrook stood near the marble fireplace, one hand lightly resting on the carved mantel, his gaze fixed, not on the crackling flames, but on her. There was an intensity in his eyes, storm-grey and unreadable, but beneath it lay exhaustion, a hint of something raw and unguarded. Clara's heart beat unevenly. She had sought out this meeting to quell her unrest, yet now the walls of propriety and restraint seemed to constrict tighter than ever. She found herself unsteady beneath the weight of his concern, the abrupt flare of his public defence still ringing stubbornly in her ears. "Lord Holbrook," she began, her voice steady but threaded with fatigue. "Your words at the table, your manner were unwise." He took a measured step forward, brow furrowing. Was it so wrong to speak out against Lady Veronica's innuendo? To stand beside you when the ton conspired to see you fall? Clara lifted her chin imperiously. "The ton is a tempest. And you, my lord, poured kindling atop its flame. You have no cause to risk your standing for my folly." His hand tightened on the mantle. "And is it folly to defend what is just? Your estate, your reputation, they are under relentless siege. I will not stand idly by." She searched his face, trying to discern the line between conviction and something more personal, something heavier. "You speak as if my troubles are yours to bear." He shook his head slowly. "In truth, I torment myself enough with my own mistakes to welcome the distraction." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "You do not know the nights I have spent, haunted by the recklessness of my youth, decisions that cast long, dark shadows. Perhaps it is my way of seeking redemption, trying to protect something not entirely mine." Clara's breath caught. In that confession, the walls she'd built around herself trembled. Widowhood had been her armour, yes, but here was a man exposing a different kind of vulnerability, one born from regrets and the fierce desire to atone. Then we share burdens heavier than mere appearances, she said softly. Stepping closer, I fear losing more than my name or fortune. I fear losing the fragile peace I have fought tooth and nail to preserve. Holbrook's gaze softened. The storm within muted momentarily. I do not pretend to offer answers, Lady Clara. Only my hand, perhaps, to hold against the dark. A frail trust kindled between them, fragile as a winter blossom daring to bloom. It was an unspoken understanding, a tacit truce made in the quiet between their fractured pasts. They stood thus, for an instant strangers, yet tethered by shared solitude and the tentative promise of something more, before the distance of circumstance pressed upon them again. The distant murmur of music from the grand ballroom stretched through the walls, a reminder that the world outside spun relentlessly onward. As cruel and indifferent as ever, the night air clung to Clara's skin like silk and secrets as she glided through the ballroom entrance. Her figure draped in a gown of deep sapphire that shimmered beneath the crystal chandeliers. The modest mask that cloaked her face was of delicate lace, threaded with silver filigree, a veil both subtle and resolute, concealing her identity and the tumult within. She moved, with measured grace, the very embodiment of controlled composure, each step a silent defiance against the sharp eyes of the ton and the whispered judgments they were certain to exchange. Music poured from the orchestra in a lilting cascade strings, weaving melodies both joyous and melancholic. The crowd swirled like a living tapestry of silk and velvet, feathers and jewels. Yet amidst the riot of colour and laughter, Clara felt removed, a solitary figure framed by the evening's grandeur and guarded like a prize that dared not reveal its secrets. Then, as if pulled by some unseen tether, her gaze landed upon him, Lord Holbrook, masked as well, yet unmistakable in his crisp black attire and the restrained strength of his posture. His eyes, clearing storm or not, found hers from across the room with the hesitance of a man entering a dance that might fracture or heal. He approached slowly, each step measured, as though fearful to shatter the fragile balance between caution and longing. When he reached her side, the space between them thrummed with unspoken words and withheld furies. "May I have this dance?" His voice was low, laced with a respect that bordered on reverence. Clara inclined her head, masking the flutter of emotion that betrayed her calm exterior. "You may, my lord." Their hands met, his warm and firm, and together they stepped into the circle of dancers. The first notes of the waltz rose, and their bodies moved in concert, a delicate negotiation of proximity and restraint. Neither rushed nor recoiled. Their movement spoke of lives carefully guarded. As they turned, the mask veiling Clara's face did little to obscure the shadow of vulnerability in her eyes, mirrored by the flicker of storm clouds in his. Between the swirl of silk and the cadence of music, the unvoiced acknowledgement of their mutual solitude hung palpably. The ballroom, with its glitter and gossip, melted away into murmur and shadow. Around them, whispers stirred like moths drawn to flame. "Is that the widow, Lady Clara? I heard the Duke has taken a peculiar interest. They say he is the only man bold enough to challenge her reputation. Scandal, surely." Yet she remains composed beneath his gaze. The tendrils of rumour curled through the air, but Clara felt oddly removed from their sting, not because of the refuge her mask afforded, but because of the man before her. In his presence, the armour she had so fiercely donned seemed less a necessity and more a choice, one weighed against the faint thrill of uncertainty. Their dance unfolded in the delicate tension of first steps towards trust, each turn and pause a conversation in itself. "Do you not tire, my lady, of hiding behind veils and whispered suspicion?" Holbrook's voice was intimate, carrying the weight of a question that was more plea than interrogation. Clara's smile was fleeting, a brush of sadness tempered with resolve. Hiding is not the same as surrendering. I must protect what remains of me, even from those who would see me undone. He nodded, understanding more in that whispered confession than any spoken oath. As much as I'd wish to offer safety, I fear these halls are minefields for us both, he admitted. Yet, I find myself reluctant to step away. Her breathing slowed, the rhythm aligning with the music and the uncertain beat of her heart. Then perhaps, she murmured, we shall navigate them together for a time. Around them, the masked figures of the season glided intrigues and alliances shifting like shadows and light. But within the dance, Clara and Lord Holbrook forged a fragile sanctuary where widowhood and burden could rest, even if only for a fleeting moment. The masked ball pulsed with life, yet in that shared space of swirling gowns and whispered suspicions, something genuine stirred between two souls, fragile yet yearning. The night might have been a theatre of constraint and deflection, but in their measured steps and quiet gazes, a new story began to take tentative shape, one neither had dared to hope for in the harsh light of day. The waltz of the masked ball continued unabated inside the grand assembly rooms, but Clara felt herself retreating, step by tentative step, away from the heavy murmurs of silk and whispered scandal that clung to the air like suffocating smoke. Each polite laugh and distant glance carried with it the sting of gossip, as if invisible fingers had already picked apart the careful fabric of her reputation, thread by vulnerable thread. The jeweled chandeliers glimmered behind her like stars in a stagnant sky, yet they shed no warmth. Her breath caught inside her chest, a fleeting panic that made her fingers tremble ever so slightly beneath her glove. Without fully understanding why, Clara slipped through the double doors and out into the garden, drawn by the sharp bite of night air that bit at her skin and cleared the suffocating fog lodged in her lungs. The roses, still heavy with dew, seemed to lean toward one another under the moon's pale gaze, as if conspiring against her. She pressed her hand to the cool stone balustrade, shielding herself from the tendrils of unease curling through her thoughts. Those murmurs inside didn't just threaten her, they sought to unmask her, to twist her widowhood from armor into prison. Her pulse was loud in her ears, a frantic tattoo against the delicate stillness of the night. Inhaling deeply, Clara tried to quell the rising tide of despair, to remind herself she had survived far worse scrutiny, even if it scorched like fire. Yet, in the quiet between the rustling leaves, she felt the fragile weight of loneliness settle anew. Footsteps came soft and sure across the gravel behind her, and she did not turn at once. She recognized the gate before the voice came, a presence that neither startled nor unsettled her, but anchored her trembling spirit in unexpected steadiness. It does not suit you here, any more than it does in that gilded ballroom. Lord Holbrook's voice was low, edged with an earnestness that made the shadows of the garden dissolve. The cold seems less biting by your side. Clara's shoulders shifted, a faint, involuntary relief brushing over her. She dared a glance, meeting his storm-grey eyes that held not judgment, but something far rarer, an unguarded vulnerability. They talk, she admitted quietly, the words bitter on her tongue. Whispers like daggers in silk. I believed widowhood would grant me some peace. Instead, it binds me tighter than any marriage. Holbrook stepped closer, hesitating only a breath before continuing. I understand more than you might think. The world has a merciless appetite for our failings. You for the stain of scandal, I for the mistakes long past yet ever present. His admission lingered in the cool night air, raw and stark. Clara's pulse quickened, curiosity overcoming her instinct to retreat. Your mistakes, she asked softly, imploring him to reveal whatever burden he bore beneath his noble title. He looked away toward the maze of hedges, where moonlight danced like fractured promises. "I fear I am the architect of much pain," he admitted, voice hoarse with the weight of regret. "Years marked by decisions made in anger and pride, choices that have cast long shadows over the people I care for. I have no right to demand your trust or friendship. But I find myself desperate to prove I can be better, that the ghosts of my past need not define my future." Clara saw in him not the Duke's polished veneer, but a man racked by his own doubts, a kindred soul tangled in the consequences of society's relentless gaze. For a moment, the world narrowed to the two of them, breathing heavily in the chill of the night, vulnerable yet steadfast. "I never thought I would meet another who understood the chains of expectation as intimately as you do," she confessed, a tentative bridge spanning the gulf between them. "What? In choosing to stand together rather than apart?" Holbrook's eyes burned with recognition and something profoundly tender. "Then let us be neither prisoners of the past, nor prisoners of society's sway. Let us be something unspoken and true, however fragile." The night air hummed with promise and caution, the cool breeze threading between them like an unvoiced vow. Beneath the argent light of the moon, two wounded hearts found momentary solace. A whispered hope, no whispered suspicion, could yet touch. Yet, as the distant strains of the ball's music drifted toward them, Clara knew the fragile sanctuary of this garden would soon be tested again by the relentless roar of London's unforgiving season. The following evening, the atmosphere inside Lady Westbury's townhouse bristled with the electric tension of high society's ceaseless machinations. The drawing-room was alive with well-drilled smiles and carefully veiled barbs, a polished battlefield where every glance and phrase wielded precision. Clara entered with her usual grace, her slender figure swathed in emerald silk that caught the gaslight with a subtle brilliance, her hazel eyes calm, yet alert. Yet beneath her composed exterior, she felt the prickling awareness of every whispered word that followed her like a shadow. Rumours had woven themselves into a tapestry of suspicion, and tonight, Clara's presence was the unspoken provocation that threatened to unravel the carefully maintained civility. The room's occupants were a chorus of clipped voices and pointed looks, their undercurrents barely masked beneath polite conversation. She moved with the delicate certainty of one accustomed to navigating treacherous waters, curtsying here, exchanging measured pleasantries there, her voice, a soft melody of refined eloquence that disarmed more aggressive tongues. Yet she was mindful of the gathering storm. It came as expected, though no less cutting for its calculation. At the pinnacle of the evening's reception, Lady Westbury, the Duke's stepmother and notorious instigator of society's cruelest gossip, glided forward, a serpent smile curling upon her lips. Clad in silk and jewels, with an air of unassailable command, she addressed the assembled guests with the subtle venom of a seasoned predator. "Surely, dear friends," Lady Westbury's voice rang clear, silk over steel, "it would be unseemly to ignore the growing familiarity between our dear widow, Lady Clara, and the newly titled Duke Holbrook. While some might raise their eyebrows at such attention, I trust everyone here knows the importance of preserving one's reputation in these delicate times." A faint ripple, barely audible, yet charged with collective awareness, passed through the room. Eyes flickered toward Clara, some sympathetic, others sharpened by judgment. The undercurrent of insinuation was unmistakable, an accusation veiled thinly beneath social decorum. Clara's fingers tightened momentarily at her side, the only outward sign of the storm within, before she met the room's expectant gaze with a serene poise that no whispered scandal could shatter. Her curtsy was deliberate, flawless, performed with an elegance that defied the sting behind Lady Westbury's words. "My lady," she said, voice clear and unwavering, I shall not dignify such perplexities with further comment. The room hung upon her every syllable, the finality in her tone brooking no argument. My conduct and honour remain intact as they always shall. There was a silence then, a stillness heavy with the unsaid, before polite murmurs resumed, cautious now in their speculations. Clara's hold on her dignity was like a fortress, walls of calm and self-command, rising impervious to the invasive gaze of her detractors. Throughout the encounter, Lord Holbrook stood near, his gaze never straying from Clara. His expression was a blend of hard resolve and protective fire, a silent vow that no insinuation would eclipse the respect he bore her. Though he said nothing aloud, his presence was a shield, fortifying her defences. As the gathering resumed its graceful dance of glances and guarded smiles, Clara felt something subtly shift within herself. The whispered storm of society's censure could not silence the truth of her own heart, nor the quiet promise that had begun to take root between her and the Duke. In that moment, under the scrutiny of 1,000 eyes and the weight of whispered scandal, Clara held fast to the fragile hope that widowhood was no longer the armour that defined her. Perhaps, instead, it was the first step towards something altogether different, a beginning. The evening air had settled deep into night's velvet embrace by the time Clara found herself sinking into the plush interior of the Duke's carriage, the muted rumble of its wheels serving as the only sound breaking the stillness between them. The city lights faded gradually into the distance, replaced by shadowed outlines of country lanes and whispering trees. Despite the darkness, the carriage's warmth wrapped around her a cocoon, both literal and metaphorical, as if the very air carried the promise of something unspoken yet palpably close. Lord Holbrook sat opposite her, his posture relaxed yet alert, hands folded neatly atop his lap. The weight of the evening scrutiny had been heavy upon them both, but in this confined space, behind closed doors and away from prying eyes, a different kind of vulnerability began to surface. His stormy grey gaze found hers in the dim light, steady and unflinching, though softened by a rare quietude. "Lady Clara," he began, voice low with a timbre that carried more openness than she had yet heard from him. "Tonight, you were as steadfast and magnificent as ever. I dare say you could silence the entire ton with the simplest turn of your head." A faint, almost wry smile tugged at his lips, an expression so unlike his usual reserve that Clara found herself momentarily caught off guard. She inclined her head with a measured grace, though her heart fluttered beneath the restraint. "I rely on necessity and habit, my lord. Maintaining one's dignity often requires a quiet resilience, especially in our position." Her gaze drifted to the window, where the moon traced silver paths through the dark foliage. "But I confess, even I am sometimes wearied by the constant battle between expectation and truth." Holbrook's brows knit together, and he leaned forward slightly, the carriage's motion swaying him almost imperceptibly. "That battle, it need not be lifelong, nor must you face it unaided. I have been a poor advocate of my own heart too, often blinded by pride and the ghosts of past errors. It has cost me dearly, and yet I find myself compelled to hope for more, not merely for companionship, but for understanding and, dare I say it, forgiveness." Her breath caught in the sudden intimacy of his confession. He had often appeared an immovable fortress himself, carved from tragedy and duty, expressions tightly bound by the era's harsh expectations. To hear the tenderness behind his words was an invitation as perilous as it was precious. "Pride has a sharp edge," Clara admitted, voice softer now, nearly a whisper meant only for him and the night. "It shields us, yes, but often cuts deeper than any blade. I have guarded my heart as one might a treasured heirloom, not out of selfishness, but fear of loss and dishonour. Widowhood became my armour, not because I desired isolation, but because the world insisted on